Lecture 28, Architect Mary Jane Elizabeth Colter. In this lecture, we will examine the works of architect Mary Jane Elizabeth Colter and analyze how her works impacted the Western fantasy, Grand Canyon, and our understandings of the history of the American West. Mary Jane Elizabeth Colter was born on the 4th of April in 1869 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But her Irish immigrant family moved west along with many other pioneers at the time. They settled in St. Paul, Minnesota. Colter attended the California School of Design when she was 17 years old to follow her passion for art and to learn a saleable skill. She needed to support her family as a teacher because her father died in 1886. The California School of Design was the Far West's first art academy and primarily served women to prepare them to be teachers, which was an acceptable profession for women because it was considered one of the caring professions. To pay for her 4 years at the school, she apprenticed in a local architect's office where she was exposed to the principles of architecture and the current cultural nationalist assertions regarding the need for an American architectural style. Architects who embraced the cultural nationalist agenda rejected European classical styles and focused instead on regional building traditions, especially those of the Spanish and Native Americans in the West. Colter returned to St. Paul, where she supported her mother and sister, and taught at Mechanic Arts High School for 15 years, teaching design, drafting, and mechanical and freehand drawing. This high school served as a trade school that trained students in the new principles and practices of the arts and crafts movement. The arts and crafts movement was an aesthetic movement reacting against the pace and mechanization of industrial life, especially mass production and mass culture. They valued hand craftsmanship and they were influenced by Romanticism, and they especially emphasized nature, specifically the inherent properties of natural materials. For instance, a property of a natural material like wood would be the wood grain. They also were interested in simplicity of form. In her spare time, Colter studied archaeology and gave public lectures in St. Paul on architecture and archaeology. In part due to her increasing public presence, Colter was contracted to design the interior of a Harvey Indian building in New Mexico in the summer of 1902. The genius of her design was the progression of rooms from museum with actual artifacts to workshop where indigenous craftsmen created art objects to a store that sold those objects but was arranged to look like a museum. Remember our discussion regarding the history of display in Western civilization? I know, it's been a long time. But especially think back to our conversations about institutional authority and the museum effect. Well, we discussed the role of museums and galleries starting as early as the 1600s. These museums and galleries, acquired significant social power due to their perceived relationship in tone to religious institutions like churches. Remember we talked about the sacred aura? They were also given significant social power because of their role in exposing people to works considered to be high culture. Museums and galleries became mandatory sites on the European and American grand tours because supposedly exposure to art objects resulted in intellectual and cultural refinement. And in Module 1, we defined the museum effect using Valerie Casey's phrasing. The museum effect is where the museum produces knowledge, and by that we mean what we believe we know about objects and their meanings, by organizing how materials are viewed. So the genius of Colter's design was employing the sociocultural understandings of the authority and power of museums in order to position tourist souvenirs as important artworks. Colter's organization of how these cultural products were viewed by tourists resulted in those tourists understanding the works as aesthetically valuable. Her design also narrated the supposed historical and cultural value of these objects, though both the historical and cultural descriptions were fabricated in most instances. Colter emphasized the craftsmanship of the artist, which was very appealing to tourists in this new age of mass production. By creating a workspace where tourists could view the production of the objects themselves. And through this display of labor, Colter also intended to spotlight the beauty and culture of indigenous peoples, which very much appealed to tourists who were influenced by Romanticism, Primitivism, and the myth of the vanishing Indian. Because of the smashing success of her interior design, the Harvey Company commissioned Colter 2 years later to design and build Hopi House at the Grand Canyon. Because of her familiarity with aesthetic conventions like Romanticism, Colter understood that strong emotional appeal was an essential element of attracting tourists to the Santa Fe Harvey hotels and concessions. So, instead of a simple museum store combination, Colter designed the Hopi building to also be inhabited by resident indigenous laborers. Remember in our previous lecture when we talked about Numpeo and her family, and they spent several seasons in Hopi House. So tourists got the museum store experience plus the feeling of having visited a Hopi home. This opportunity for perceived intimacy with laborers who were positioned as craftsmen and members of the vanishing race was a welcome counterpoint for tourists to the developing mass culture of the early 20th century. The Harvey Company hired Colter as their full-time lead architect and designer in 1910, and she designed 3 more buildings at the Grand Canyon, 26 buildings total for the Harvey Company. Her works are the core architecture at the Grand Canyon. These buildings include Hopi House, Lookout Studio, Hermit's Rest, and Desert View Watchtower in Kiva. Colter employed materials native to the area and worked to mimic the natural irregularities of the rocks and boulders. Colter was the progenitor of a modern style of architecture previously unseen in the United States or in other Western countries, a style that drew inspiration from the environment as well as indigenous forms. Because of her commitment to creating a truly American architectural style, it was important to Colter that her works not only highlight the beauty of the natural American landscape, but also honor the history of the region, even if it was an inaccurate colonialist history. And she also wanted to honor the cultures that were central to the region's development. To do this, Colter often employed indigenous peoples in her construction projects, especially crafting decorative materials for the structures. One of her most notable designs is the Watchtower in Kiva at Desert View. The tower was meant to appear as an ancient ruins and offer tourists the opportunity to enter and experience a sacred Native American spiritual space, a kiva, which they otherwise would never be permitted to enter. She employed Hopi artist Fred Caboti to decorate the interior with symbols and paintings that supposedly had cultural and religious significance to the surrounding indigenous populations. Of Caboti, Colter wrote he is, quote, counted one of the 3 greatest modern Indian artists. As well as being a great draftsman, Caboti is saturated with the ancient lore of his people. These legends, which we count as folklore are to him a living religion. He approaches them with great reverence. End quote. While the tower was completely contrived for commercial purposes and had no actual historical value, it was and is extremely popular. It performs a part of the Western fantasy and is integral in the continuation of the imagined past of the American West. The structure offered tourists, both then and now, the feeling of visiting an important ruin from America's past that, at least in its romantic mystique, rivals the ancient sites of Europe. Colter's contributions to the imagined past of the American West, especially the Desert View Watchtower in Kiva, have undergone serious scrutiny in contemporary cultural studies. Like the works of George Catlin, Thomas Cole, and other artists and writers working in the Romantic tradition, Colter's works employ the composite technique. Her buildings are composites. They are the combination of parts from different sources, including imagined sources, to create a whole. And this technique emphasizes a concept. It is the concept that the artist privileges over the accuracy of any kind of replication. Like Cole, Colter wanted to express the holistic experience of a place, the American Southwest. And like Cole and Catlin and others, Colter can be accused of imperialist nostalgia. And while paintings and poetry clearly shape and perpetuate certain narratives of history, it can be argued that architecture may have a more profound, lasting impact on the stories we tell about our past. A reminder, in our introduction to this module in Lecture 22, we noted that architecture is a particularly resilient medium, able to weather time and change. And scholars David Martin and Lee Jacobus asserted that, quote, not only do the forms of architecture preserve the past more carefully than do most things, but these structures also enlighten the past, end quote. If we think about Colter's works and their impact through this perspective, we can see how her structures might prove particularly problematic and contribute significantly to the social issues of history and memory. Colter's works offer us significant insights into the sociocultural values and practices of the early 20th century. Yet, her works purport to be and are often perceived as ancient structures built by indigenous peoples. In this way, her structures, like the film Dances with Wolves, while meant to honor and memorialize the lifeways of a marginalized group, actually functions to draw attention away from the actual indigenous works. And, worse yet, Colter's works have been accused of appropriating indigenous cultures for commercial gain. Colter has been criticized by scholars in our contemporary society for her role in perpetuating an imagined history of the West that appropriates the land and cultures of indigenous peoples. One scholar criticizes, quote, Colter restored for American consumption the indigenous architecture of the dispossessed, creating hotels, train stations, shops, and restaurants modeled on Native American and Hispanic cultures. And then sarcastically states, quote, Colter even built ancient ruins, end quote. While these critiques may be justified, Colter's works, like Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West Show, Dances with Wolves, and all of the aesthetically significant cultural products we have examined this semester, is just a bit more complicated. What is often overlooked is Colter's trailblazing and her aesthetic achievements. Colter's designs significantly influenced the aesthetics embraced by the National Park Service in all of its western parks. Though her designs were imaginative interpretations of indigenous structures and cultural objects, she did privilege the artisanship of the indigenous peoples themselves, especially indigenous women, in the construction and decoration of her designs. Colter was also a female who was challenging the very rigid definitions of femininity in a time when women were not considered U.S. citizens. We didn't have the right to vote. She was one of a very few females able to succeed as an architect. The first documented American woman to work as a professional architect was Louise Blanchard Bethune of New York in 1881, who did open a practice, but she opened the practice with the assistance of her husband. She was admitted into the American Institute of Architects in 1888. In 1880, the first woman, Margaret Hicks, graduated with a degree in architecture from Cornell University. Over half of the architectural programs in the U.S. at that time openly denied admission to women. By 1910, there were still only 50 professional female architects in the United States, most of whom had to partner with their husbands to obtain any kind of legitimacy. Even today, practicing architecture is still a male-dominated profession. In the United States, the National Architectural Accrediting Board did report in 2009 that a significant 41% of architecture graduates were women. However, the AIA National Associates Committee report from 2004 notes the percentage of licensed female architects as only 20%. So there's a great deal of women who are graduating from architectural programs and who are not going on to become licensed architects. In 2003, an AIA Women in Architecture study found that women accounted for approximately 27% of staff in U.S. architecture firms, and that's not lead architect. As with the majority of aesthetically significant cultural products we have examined, Mary Jane Elizabeth Colter's works simultaneously perpetuated and challenged social and cultural values and practices. She employed aesthetics of Romanticism, Primitivism, and the Western, and her works were integral to social issues like gender, race, class, colonialism, the nature-culture dichotomy, and history and memory. Her works participated in the construction and performance of an imagined past. They simultaneously reinforced and challenged cultural assumptions about indigenous peoples. They overtly disrupted the traditional gender norms that governed the discipline of architecture. So Colter's architecture functioned and continues to function as a stage upon which the social relations that produce the social issues we study were and are negotiated.